Ladies and gentlemen, this session is intended to talk about the file management that you can do inside of SharePoint, understanding that SharePoint and Microsoft Teams are directly linked to one another through the Microsoft 365 group. So if, for example, you were to work with files inside of Teams, those files that you worked on inside of Teams would also at the same time be using the SharePoint tools in order to manage them. So by learning SharePoint features in file management, we at the same time will learn and understand the file management tools that are available to us in Microsoft Teams. So before we get off the ground here, our first poll question of this session is, what are you currently using more of? What does your team use currently when you are working with files? And I would like to hear if, how many teams are right now just emailing things around. That's, it's still in the modern age, a very accepted business practice, even though, of course, we're trying to push for as much cloud work as possible. Just want to see where everybody is on this. Don't want to talk about aspirations here. I want to talk about reality. Lisa says she doesn't like to share. I understand completely. All right, and we already have some questions around file sharing and things like that, so I do want to make sure that we answer all of those questions. Oh boy, look at that. 61% of people are still emailing stuff around. Okay, good to know. I'm glad to hear it. Okay, well, not glad to hear it. I'm glad you shared. All right, so what does that tell us? Yeah, Chris emails things to himself. That's exactly right. I still email things to myself too, but it's because I actually use so many different accounts on so many different platforms that it's actually not possible for me to share things seamlessly every time. So a lot of times I will unfortunately have to email myself things. All right, so let's start off with using Teams and SharePoint either together or independently. So in Microsoft Teams, we have the idea that we have the chat space in Microsoft Teams and the team space in Microsoft Teams. And in both locations, we can easily use the attach file feature. So here, for example, if I'm in the chat in Microsoft Teams and I go to this conversation that I'm having with Alicia, Faye, and Miguel within my own business, I can go to the chat box at the bottom, click the paperclip, and upload a new file. I can then find a file that I would like to share with these folks, maybe this sales team policies file right here. There we go. And you'll see here it's creating US sales team policies 2. Now, why is it creating US sales team policies 2? It's because of this simple piece of information. One second. In Microsoft Teams, Teams never saves files itself. Teams does not have a functionality for saving and holding on to file-based information. Instead, Microsoft Teams leverages existing Microsoft 365 tools in order to share files. Now, in the instance of this conversation between myself, Alicia, Faye, and Miguel, this group of people that I'm talking with is not something that is organized very strictly, right? This is just a group of people I put together on the fly. And so for that reason, if I consider my two options for file storage in the cloud, those two things being OneDrive and SharePoint, I hope that you can see that this is more of a OneDrive scenario. that this is not a structured SharePoint scenario, but more of a seat of the pants OneDrive scenario. And you can see this by going here. Okay, so this file, US sales team policies. If I go to my web browser and I pull up my OneDrive, I'll see in my OneDrive that there is a folder in here called Microsoft Teams chat files. And sure enough, when I go into the Microsoft Teams chat files, there is the US Sales Team Policies 2 docx file. So by sharing things through Microsoft Teams, but through the chat feature in Microsoft Teams, I use my OneDrive and I really spur of the moment share that file with the 3 other people who are on the conversation. So here Neil is sharing with Faye, Miguel, and Alicia. But at that same moment, you can easily see here how I could take Miguel's permission away by simply clicking the stop sharing with Miguel, or how I could downgrade Faye's ability down to just being able to view the file. So when you chat with somebody and you share files with them, it is in this way. It's using OneDrive and it's in a very person by person basis. However, when we use the Teams area on the left-hand side and we create a new team like Project Tampa, for example, here in Project Tampa, I have created a few channels called General, Planning, Budgeting, and Development. And again, here in Project Tampa, I can start a conversation and I can add files. And because I recognize that there is a difference between a team that has a specific membership and a conversation that does not have a specific membership, I see here that sharing a file through this conversation and seeing it on the Files tab will be handled differently. And here I can see that the way it handles it differently is here in the top right-hand corner. We can open this in SharePoint. So allow me to be very clear here at the outset. Teams and SharePoint are not really synchronizing copies of files. Instead, what's happening here is that Teams is getting the information about the files from SharePoint. SharePoint is doing all of the file management for us. So when I click on Open in SharePoint, I see the SharePoint site. I see the document library here on the left that contains different folders, in this case, General, Budgeting, Planning, and Development, and the files that are inside there. And the changes that we make to these files, again, I want to be very clear here. I don't think of it as if I change a file here in SharePoint, it becomes synchronized with Teams, but instead I think of Teams as simply being a view to what's already in SharePoint. So when I look at something in Teams and I look at something in SharePoint, I'm actually looking at the same file simultaneously and not actually looking at 2 separate copies of that file. Again, here I can click as Alicia on the insurance FAQ document and edit through SharePoint. And I can also go over here to Teams as Neil, click on the insurance FAQ document and edit through Microsoft Teams. So on the right side of the screen, we see that Neil is logged into Microsoft Teams and that Neil is able to see Alicia is making changes to the document. On the left side of the screen, we see Alicia is logged into SharePoint and we see Alicia sees that Neil is logged into this document. And then Alicia can come in and make changes to the document and Neil can also make changes to the document. Okay. Perfect. So everybody, now what Chris is asking about is sort of like this whole big picture thing. So Chris says, if I attach a file in Teams to share to somebody, then I edit that same file in the native application. Will the version in Teams be the initial uploaded version or the amended version? So the thing that you have to be clear about here, everybody, is this question of editing in the native application and whether the file that you're editing is the file that's in Teams or SharePoint, or it's the one that's still on your desktop. So let me go back to Teams and let me go back to SharePoint. Here we go. So here is SharePoint Project Tampa. Here is Teams Project Tampa. And let's grab a file and put it into Teams/SharePoint. Okay. So let's see if we can find something new. Okay, so this 2021 Southeast Asia sales team policies. I'm going to click and drag this file into Teams like so and let go. And now let's take a look at this file in all the different locations. So we've just uploaded it through Teams. You can see it over here in Microsoft Teams. SharePoint, because it's a web page, a lot of times you actually have to come over here and just hit the refresh button, and the refresh button will allow it to show up. There you go. Now, everybody, deep breath with me here. These three files, how many files are there? And are these files synchronized with one another? The file that's on my desktop right now in the sample files folder is the file that we used to put something in Teams and SharePoint, but those two things are not connected. So everybody, right here in the sample files folder, this Word document is not in any way, shape, or form connected to what's happening in Teams and SharePoint. However, what I see in Teams and what I see in SharePoint are the exact same file. So if I were to go in, and let's just do this here, let's go to the original that's on my hard drive still. Because the original that's on my hard drive does not have any connection to what's online, I can double click on it, open it in the native application, and I'll just go right up to the top of the page and put something obnoxious up here. And save it. Now, everybody, remember what I've done here is gone to a file that's sitting on my hard drive and make a change to it that has absolutely no impact on this file right here. You'll see that it does not contain the change that I put at the top of the document. And over here on the left, it has absolutely no bearing on this document that I see here. Because again, they are not connected to the thing that's online or the thing that's on my desktop. However, whether you use SharePoint or Teams, you can go to the file in question. You can either click on it and edit that file in Teams or in SharePoint, or you can use the ellipsis button on the right and choose to open it in the desktop application. So this option here, Open in App, means the file will be in Teams and SharePoint, but I like to use the full version of the desktop application on this. So I click here on Open an App, and Microsoft Word opens up. But remember, in the top left-hand corner, it's currently set to autosave. And I can see that when I go to File and Save a Copy, it chooses Save a Copy here because it's already saved online. And I might need to make a new copy of that file, but it's constantly saving the changes. So I will say this is a change through the desktop application. Now remember, autosave is turned on, so I am not pushing the save button, but you can see that Word is automatically saving my changes right up there at the top. So now when I decide to share something with somebody through Teams or through SharePoint, I have the file that I just made changes to. So here, if I were to, let's say, let's go ahead and let's do it this way. I'll copy a link to it, like so, and I will email that to my coworker. Okay, so I'm coming over here to Outlook and sending an email. There we go. So I'll send this to Alicia. And paste. So if you notice right here, this is a link that goes to Teams, but right down here it says it's actually on the SharePoint site, Project Tampa, in the shared documents library. So the question that Chris is clarifying right now is when he goes in to the Teams post and he works on the file in the Teams post, he's curious as to what is shared when you go to the same file in SharePoint or things like that. Okay, so I want to be very, very clear about this. When I look at the Southeast Asia sales team policies here in SharePoint, here in SharePoint as Alicia, or here in Teams, whether here in the Files tab or here on the Posts tab there, everywhere that I look at it, it's the exact same file. Okay, so there is not any synchronization or anything that has to happen there. It's constantly staying up to date between SharePoint and Teams. Let's see, so to clarify, I mean, if I open the original Teams post with the link, after I've edited the file in SharePoint, yes. So any link to a file that exists in Teams/SharePoint is a link to that file. There is just that file. There's not an original copy of it or anything like that. It is the new version every time it's edited. Now, if you notice right here, everybody, this is something I want to be very clear about. If I go over to, I gotta repopulate this a little bit. Okay, so if I go to any file inside of Microsoft Teams and I go to the ellipsis on the right-hand side, you'll notice that there are no options in this ellipsis menu here for looking at previous versions of the document. But if I go to the exact same location inside of Microsoft SharePoint, if I click the ellipsis button in SharePoint, you'll notice version history right there. And the version history allows you to see the previous versions of this document. Now, allow me to be crystal clear about this, everybody. I don't like this, but I get what they're trying to do. And this gets back to a question that Hunter was asking about earlier today, which is around the idea of working with metadata and things we talked about in other places about checking a file in and doing those sorts of things. I want everybody to understand which direction Microsoft is going and how it plays out here. Microsoft had SharePoint in place for 15 years, and it was a successful application, but unfortunately had very, very low success in getting a lot of people inside of a given business to use it. And to that point, everybody, if you're on the IT side of things and you think to yourself, I think SharePoint is going to work better if it's done the old way, go back to the last poll question that was just up a couple of minutes ago. Did you see the percentage of people who email files to each other? This SharePoint was around in 2003, 2007, 2010, 2013, and 2016. And today, in this class, 61% of you, when asked, said, we just email files to each other. SharePoint did not make the change people wanted it to make, period. It just didn't work. Let's be very clear about that. We may say in our specific use case, we think it works great, The reality of the situation is, over the past 15 years, SharePoint didn't work. It did not make the change it was intended to make. So Microsoft looks at that. And they say, okay, we really love SharePoint. We're all in on SharePoint. We love SharePoint, but nobody else loves SharePoint. Nobody does. Okay, maybe you love SharePoint, but you have to understand 61% of this class just said they don't use SharePoint when sharing files. Is that successful? Does that sound successful to you? I think it sounds like an awful percentage. So when Microsoft sees this company Slack come out of nowhere, and everybody goes, oh, we love Slack. Oh yeah, we just use Slack. We share files. We talk to one another. Bing, 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 bing. And everything actually happens in Slack. Microsoft goes, oh, all right, Slack has to have figured something out. And they tried to buy Slack. And Slack told them to hit the bricks. Slack said, no, we're not going to sell to you. And Microsoft said, oh, okay. If we keep going down the trajectory we're going down, we're going to have this tool that we believe in called SharePoint that literally nobody's ever going to use. And everybody's going to say that Google Docs and Slack are way better than Microsoft products. So what did Microsoft do? They said it's time to pivot. They went out and they built Microsoft Teams to try to replicate what Slack was doing as close as possible. And how does Slack work? When you want to share a file with somebody, you just share a file with somebody. You don't think about it. You just share a file with them. And so here, if I go to the Posts tab inside of Project Tampa and I want to share a file with somebody, I start a conversation and I share a file with them. And I upload that file and they've got it now, right? So I'm sending this file over and life is good. Now, does that not allow me or force me to fill in metadata about that file? 100%. Is it possible that that's a very bad thing for my organization? 100%. Is it 10,000 times more likely that a basic user of Teams is going to actually use Teams to share a file with somebody? 10,000% yes. It's just reality. When things are too complicated for people, they don't use them. That's it. 61% of people say, the heck with it, I just send an email and attach it in an email. So Teams has been simplified. Now, to go even further than that, Teams has been simplified so much that when you look at a file in here and you click on that file, you don't see that there are previous versions of this file. You don't see, hey, Bob made this change and Susan made this change. You don't get any of that stuff because, for better or worse, and I believe honestly a little bit worse, I'm totally like, believe me, I want power tools. They don't give you that version history here in Teams because they want it to be simple. They want it to be easy to use because the easier it is to use, the more likely people are to use it. That's it. That's the whole thing. Now, for those of you who really want to use these tools in a powerful way, well, then you go over to SharePoint and you look at the exact same thing in SharePoint and it goes, oh yeah, you want the version history? No problem. Here's the version history. Look at the difference in the size of this menu, everybody. See this menu right here? Look at this menu right here. Very clear, right? And one of the options in this menu is open this in SharePoint. So in Teams, what can we do? We can open the file in whichever application we want. We can get a link to this file. We put it on a tab up at the top, download a copy, delete it, pin it to the top, give it a new name, move it or copy it. And then here under more, we can check out just because maybe we want to check that file out. Here in SharePoint, we can preview the file and share the file and copy a link to the file and manage the access to the file and automate that with Power Automate. And So you can see here that SharePoint is giving you access to the exact same file, but with more bells and whistles. Is everybody clear on that idea? Okay. I understand, and believe me, everybody, I taught SharePoint Designer. I taught people how to make their own custom SharePoint workflows, writing code, make their own home pages, writing code and moving things all over the place. I have let all that go. That stuff doesn't exist anymore because Microsoft realized nobody was actually using it. That's it. That's the whole kit and caboodle. If nobody was actually using it, they had to do something that would get people to buy into it. So here is how we get people to buy into it. If you go into Teams and you access your files, it's easier to find them, easier to work with them. You don't have as many options, and that's okay. Here in SharePoint, we have a lot more options, a lot more power, and we can make specific choices along the way. Again, in the same way, a lot of people will ask the question, can we have different permission levels on different folders and stuff like that? And everybody, yes, you can absolutely do that. But here's the thing. Does that make it easier to use this or harder? It makes it harder to use. 100% it does. And so for that reason, everybody, if we use Microsoft Teams to work on files, everybody who belongs to a team inside of Microsoft Teams has the exact same permissions to every single file you see here. That's it. Every single file. You cannot go to this ellipsis right here and change the permission levels on this file right here in the midst of the team, because that would make it harder to participate as a team member. So what do we do instead? Well, if we want to change permissions, if we want to go very specific and detailed with what people are capable of inside of files, we go to SharePoint, because SharePoint is the place where all of that power actually resides. So here I can go to the ellipsis and I can manage access to this file, right? I can get in directly to that specific file and make changes to those permissions. Otherwise, the default permissions are handled by the membership of the team. Here on Project Tampa, if I click on the ellipsis right there and I go to Manage Team, I can see that there are 2 owners of the team and there are 2 members of the team, and all the owners of the team are able to do administrative work and all the members of the team are able to do collaboration. And that's it. They're able to collaborate on every single file that you see in every single one of these tabs. Now, if I go over to SharePoint, I see the exact same membership up here in the corner, right? I see 2 owners and I see 2 members. Now, if you decide that you think you want a set of files that has different permissions on it, here's what I would recommend to you. Go to your Home tab up here in the top left-hand corner, and then click on New and make yourself a new document library. Now, why am I telling you to do this? It's because all the documents that are currently being used in Teams should just continue to be used like that in a flexible, relaxed way. But if you have very specific choices about particular files, you can go to New and click on Document Library right here, and you can make a new document library called, for example, Archive. And I can click on Create, and these, let's see here, Archive Library. I already had an archive in here before. So I have an archive library, and maybe I decide to put some files in the archive library, like so. Now, how would I make this different? Well, I might go up to the gear in the top right-hand corner. Everybody remember, there are things that you can do in SharePoint you cannot do in Teams, because to a fault, they are trying to make Teams simple to use. So here in SharePoint, I can go to this library, click the gear, and I can change the library settings insofar as I can change the permissions and other things. So I can click on library settings and then go over here to my library permissions. There we go, permissions for this document library. And this archive library can have different permissions from the host site. Notice right up here it says, this library inherits permissions from its parent, which is the SharePoint site Project Tampa. I'm going to click right up here in the top left, the Stop Inheriting Permissions button, and click OK. And now each one of these groups on the SharePoint site are allowed to have different types of permissions. Now, if you remember, everybody, I just got done showing you that on my team and on my SharePoint site, there were 2 owners and there were 2 members. And the owners of the SharePoint site are given full control. That's administrative access over everything that's happening in SharePoint. And here the membership is currently given edit access, which is contributor access. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click the checkbox for these members, and I'm going to edit their permissions so that they are not allowed to edit those files. I take away their edit rights and replace it with read-only rights, and click OK. So here I have a document library called Documents, which is still freewheeling and easy to use because it has these folders that are coming directly from the Teams channels. Excuse me. But in addition to that, I have over here in my site contents on the left, this thing called the archive library. The archive library has documents in it, but it has different permission levels so that my basic users of the site cannot cannot edit those things. Okay, so when it comes to managing your files, always remember that Microsoft Teams and SharePoint are accessing the same files, but the Teams is doing so in a more lightweight way, an easier to use way. And you probably don't want to stand in the way of that flexibility and simplicity, but instead use SharePoint to add on additional features that make it potentially more complicated. So everybody, poll question here. What is it that controls the default permission levels that you see inside of SharePoint? Default being an important word right there. Okay. Okay. So coming out of this in just a moment, after everybody gets their credit through the poll question, I'm going to answer questions like Rita's question about moving files around, synchronizing them, working on versions and stuff like that. Let's make sure we all get credit. Beautiful. 57% of you are on the track right there, everybody. Default permissions in SharePoint are controlled by that Microsoft 365 group. Now, you can go to the SharePoint site and set up their unique permissions. And, excuse me one second. And we're back. And Active Directory and other tools for managing people's identities within the Microsoft products are the way that we identify who people are and what they have the rights to do. But it's the Microsoft 365 group that is actually granting the default permissions in our SharePoint site. Okay, so the question that Rita was asking is about being able to share files, to move files, but also being able to really have your SharePoint site be a location. So let me take a moment here and discuss that with you. So first of all, when you're working with files, anytime that you have a folder within a library, you can click the checkbox for that folder. Or it's weird, everybody. I don't know why they decided to go with the check bubble here, which is very different from every checkbox I've ever experienced. And you can see here that we can decide to share it with other people, but also there's this feature to move this or copy it to another location. So if you want to move large quantities of files from one location to another, you can simply click the checkbox for that particular folder or whatever you happen to be looking at, and then copy it to a different location. You can browse for the appropriate location and send those things over. Now, the other thing that the Rita's asking about in the Q&A box, though, is what about even things like if somebody sends you files and they send them to you through like a download site, or they send them to you through an email or something like that. And it feels like I have to, if I want to put them in SharePoint, the first thing I've got to do is I've got to take those files in and put them on my hard drive or a network drive or something like that, and then upload them to SharePoint. Now, if you're using just OneDrive, remember that OneDrive is an application running on your machine that gives you this thing right over here, which is your synchronized version of OneDrive in your folder system. So you can see right here that basically, if I wanted to, let's say that I go over here to my email and I just had a PDF or something, right? If I go in here and I go to save it, you can see I can save it directly to my OneDrive here. And even when I choose to download it, I can easily here go ahead and literally just drag and drop it directly into my OneDrive, right? So OneDrive is a folder location right there. So OneDrive is a folder location because there's software that is synchronizing your hard drive with the cloud at all times. But I want you to notice, everybody, do you see this right here on the on the left side of my screen? Let me make this quieter and simpler here. You see this thing called Neil Malik right over here? If I click on it, you see this? You know what this is? These are two SharePoint locations that I've decided to synchronize as well. Now, there isn't a separate application for this. If you would like to synchronize a SharePoint library with your hard drive, you're going to use OneDrive to do it, because remember, everybody, OneDrive and SharePoint are actually the same thing. And so here, if I go to a SharePoint site like Project Tampa, and I go to a library like the documents library right here, you'll notice that right up here at the top, there is a sync button. Now, everybody, I would not recommend that you do this with every place that you go to, because to be quite frank, if you are working with enough files with your different coworkers, this is going to be a lot of unnecessary synchronization. I would typically just use SharePoint Teams, but you can click the sync button. And as you can see here, it opens OneDrive to do it, right? So OneDrive is the program on your computer that is going to sync whatever's happening in this library with your hard drive. There we go. This might take a couple of minutes, so I might go ahead and talk right over the top of it. But what it's doing right now is over here in my folder structure under Neil Malik, right here on the left, you can see that now I have Project Tampa documents. And you see here, it's currently synchronizing those folders that are in the document library with this folder location right there. So if you do something like this to answer, to go back to Rita's question was, if I get a whole bunch of files, could I just save them directly into SharePoint? And the answer to that is that the files have to exist locally first, right? The idea here is that I want you to imagine you are looking at a website that has some files on it. That website is currently the thing that owns the files. There's not really a mechanism for saying, hey, take those files and put them on this other website, right? Like that we can use at least. So instead, the mechanism that's there is go to the files that are on that website, download them to me so that I can put them on the website. And so here you can see how this eliminates that middleman process, because this is on my hard drive, but it is constantly being synchronized with the library. So this is a way that you could get to do what Rita was just asking about. Let's see here. Oh, so Chris is asking a question. If you copy files over, does that create a unique version of those files? Yes. So right here, if I say to copy those files to a new location, I'm going to save them to my OneDrive right here. Right. So I'm just going to copy the employee list over to my OneDrive. There's now going to be a second copy of employee list, not a synchronized version of the employee list that's been put in that new location. Okay. Looking good so far. So next item on the list, let me make sure, got my whole checklist today. Okay. Ooh, Devin's asking a great question here. Can I copy and paste it by using Control C and Control V? You can only use that if you're using your folder system. The Control C, Control V thing won't work inside of your browser. But to our point here, if you have your OneDrive location here and you have other file locations here, you could use copy and paste because you're using your desktop app to do that copying and pasting. Yep. Okay. So what I'd like to do here is I would like to go to Project Tampa, and I'd like to talk to you about version history real quick. If you go to any file that has been worked upon, you can click on the vertical ellipsis button here in SharePoint, and you can go to version history here. When you go to version history, you will see any previous versions of the document. Now, if you go to a previous version of the document and use the drop-down menu here, you can always choose to restore that. And what it does is it makes version 3 of that document right here. So we have version 1 of the document that was originally created. Then we have edits that I made at 6:14 a.m. And then I have a revisited version of version 1 that became version 3 right there. Also, if you think that a previous version was a terrible mistake, you can use the ellipsis, and you can see there that you can delete previous versions of the document as well. Now, to that point, everybody, let's go back to our permissions idea for a moment. If you go to your gear in the top right-hand corner in SharePoint, you'll be able to see that you have your site permissions here on the right, which is, controlling who can do what on the SharePoint site. And you'll see here that we have the site owners with full control, we have the site members with edit rights, and we have the site visitors who don't have any access at all. And we can go to advanced permission settings. What I want to do here is I want to illustrate to you what your permission levels actually look like in SharePoint. If you come here to this permissions area and you click on the button for permission levels, you'll see the definitions of the different permission levels people can be given. And if you know that the members on your SharePoint site and on your team are given edit access, you can click on it and then you can see through the checkboxes what those people are capable of doing. So notice here that if somebody is an editor on a SharePoint site, they are allowed to look at old versions of documents as well as delete old versions of documents. So if you wanted to, if you were in the mood to make changes to how your SharePoint site worked, you could disable the ability for somebody to delete old versions of the document simply by modifying what it meant to be an edit level permission user. So I can decide that those people cannot delete old versions of the document and then save it. And now anybody who's working on my SharePoint site who has edit access gives them that right to those particular documents right there. Okay. So we have this idea that documents living in SharePoint can be edited using the desktop application, using SharePoint, and by using Teams. And then in every instance of that, you can co-author that document. That is to say, 2 or more people can edit a document at the same time and see what those changes are. And then we get new versions of said document. Now, the other thing I'd like to point out to you here is that on your document libraries, there are many different settings that could be helpful. So let me give you an example of this. Here on my document library here in SharePoint, I have a folder structure. And then potentially here in the general folder, maybe I decide to make more folders like subfolder A and subfolder B. And this gets back to a question that Hunter was asking about earlier. If you are newish to SharePoint, you might not really get this, but something that's been harped on a lot in the Microsoft environment is that folders are really kind of bad news. If you use a lot of folders in your email, if you use a lot of folders in SharePoint, by putting things into subfolders, you make the organization system a lot more difficult to manage and a lot more difficult to navigate. Because depending on your mood at any given point in time, you might decide to put something in one folder or another, and that can be very troubling to have a different experience depending on your mood or who's doing it, right? If you have multiple people working in SharePoint together, they might each decide to put things in different folders for different reasons. And so for that reason, everybody, it's a good idea to know that in SharePoint, you can create your own custom views. So here I am on the general folder, and I realize that there are some files in here I can see and other files that I can't see because they're inside these subfolders. And what's interesting here is that if I go to the gear here in SharePoint and I look at the library settings for the SharePoint site, exactly right, Lisa. Yeah, it's almost like you're two different people, right? The day you put it away and the day you go looking for it are two completely different things. And hey, I mean, anybody who's ever said, "Where did I put my wallet?" knows exactly what that's all about, right? On day one, you put your wallet down in a place that made perfect sense. And on day two, that place has absolutely, it doesn't make any sense at all to you afterwards at all. So here's an example of how we can leverage that. Right down here, we can create what's called a new view of this library. Now, when we create a new view of the library, we're deciding what to see and how to see it. So if I click on Create View right here, and I create a new standard view of the library, let's think about things we might decide to change. So Hunter's been asking about metadata, to give you an example. Now, metadata means the columns that are on your different documents. And you can see here that all the different columns we have in the library, we can turn on and off. We can click the check boxes to turn them on, click the check boxes to turn them off, and either see that data or not. And then down here, we can sort by different columns, and we can filter by different columns, and we can group by different columns. So let's say, for example, I decide that I wanted to sort by, let's go by the name of the file, right? So I'll go to sort and I'll go to title. And let's say that I want to group it together, right? I'll group it together by, let's go with type, which is what file type it is. So I want to see it in alphabetical order by name, and I want to see it grouped together by the type of document. So up here, I'll call this view something like document types. Now, here's the really interesting part, everybody. Down here at the bottom, I can open up this folders panel right here, and I can say, let's pretend folders don't even exist. See that right there? The folders plus sign, show all items without folders. That's not show the items that don't have folders. That's show all the items pretending that folders don't even exist. And when I click OK, you'll see that this view of the library now does not include the different subfolders. Does everybody see that? Here on the drop-down menu, I can go to all documents and I can see the different folders, or I can go to document types and I don't see the folders and I just see them grouped together by the different types of files. And so in the same way, I can go over to Teams. And now when I look at my files in Microsoft Teams, I can either see the files with the folders right there, or I can use the little drop-down menu. This is taking a little while to refresh, but there'll be a drop-down menu right here in the corner where I can choose to not see it with folders. All right, everybody. Last poll question of this segment is, hey, everybody, do you remember whether you can still check files out in SharePoint if you need to? Okay. So we're coming up on the end of this particular block. as the poll question is up here so everybody gets their credit. And what I'd like to revisit for a moment is the following. Everything that we do with files in Microsoft Teams is actually done in Microsoft SharePoint. So that means that every file that you ever put into Teams goes into SharePoint, and SharePoint is managing things like version history, views, etc. And for that reason, if you are somebody who is a power user or an administrator over the team, it would behoove you to spend a lot of time inside of SharePoint rather than Teams. You're absolutely right, everybody. Majority of you got that one right, which is yes, you can absolutely check files out. It's still a feature that's built into working on files in SharePoint as well as Teams. But like I said earlier, and I did harp on this a little bit today, Microsoft is moving more and more towards flexible, relaxed ways of dealing with files. And we can acknowledge that and either work against that, and that's totally fine, but we just have to understand we're working against the direction Microsoft's going, or we can reapproach the problem altogether. Hope everybody learned something valuable here. I'll talk to you very shortly.